While I was asleep, Gabriel came to me and he said, recite Iqra. And I said, what shall I recite? And he squeezed me so tightly that I thought I would die. And then he released me and he said, recite Iqra. And I said, what shall I recite? And he squeezed me again, and I thought I would die again. And then he let me go, and he said, recite. And I said, what shall I recite? And then he said, Iqra, Bismi Rabbiki alladhi khalaq, khalaq al-insan min alaq. Iqra wa rabbuka al-akram, alladhi allama bil-qalam, allama al-insan ma lam ya'lam. Recite in the name of your Lord who created humankind from a clot. Recite, and your Lord is most generous, the one who taught by the pen that which humankind did not know. So I recited it, and he left me, and then I woke up. I felt as though those words were written on my heart. I begin my presentation today with one of the very first Muslim journeys, the journey of Muhammad ibn Abdullah toward leadership as a prophet, the man whom over 1.5 billion Muslims around the world believed to be the messenger of God, Rasulullah. The story that I just read is included in Ibn Ishaq's biography of the Prophet, which is quoted in at least 2 of our books. It is the story of how, according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad began to receive the Quran, which in English literally means recitation, Iqra, Quran. Muhammad began his Muslim journey as a prophet, not so much by traveling anywhere, but by sitting still. According to Islamic tradition, he was visited by the angel Gabriel while meditating in a cave on Mount Hira outside Mecca, Arabia. The angel appeared when he was already 40 years old, so he had spent a lot of time in solitude and contemplation before he ever started receiving Quranic revelations. Now, on the one hand, his journey toward prophetic leadership is the particular story of one man. It is singular. No one could hope to make the same journey. From an Islamic perspective, no one has, and no one ever will. But on the other hand, there are elements of this journey that all people, Muslim or not, might be able to recognize as part of the journey of humanity. Because Muhammad, before he was a prophet, he was an orphan and a businessman, a lover, a husband, and a father. And even after he received that first revelation that I just recited, he played roles that are familiar to all of us. He was a countercultural rebel, a politician, a warrior, a judge, a person of deep faith. And when he died, one of his dearest and most loyal companions, Abu Bakr, reminded everyone that in the end, Muhammad was human, not superhuman, saying, for those of you who worship Muhammad, you should understand that he is dead. But God lives, and God can never die. Now, like the Prophet Muhammad, all of the other Muslims that we meet in the Muslim journey bookshelves are human beings, both similar to and different from each of us. When we read these books, we inevitably discover thoughts, feelings, and experiences that seem to resonate for us because they reflect a part of ourselves. We recognize ourselves in some of the novel's characters, or find ourselves agreeing with someone's argument. But as we read, as we travel, as we see new things, we also notice things that are foreign, that are disturbing, experiences and thoughts that we might find contrary to our deepest values. Many times, this is because our fundamental values, assumptions, and beliefs, who we were before we ever set foot on our own journey, shape what we see along the path. And yet, in reading and talking about new, sometimes frightening, sometimes disturbing things, we are transformed. We know what we did not know, just as that Quranic verse that I quoted at the beginning tells us. We may not like it all the time, but we are changed. Now, as we read through the Muslim Journey's bookshelf, we discover both the familiar and the strange. And it becomes clear pretty quickly that there is no one Muslim journey. One of the reasons that I admire this project is because its 25 books, films, and other components are a diverse and engaging set of resources for understanding Muslim journeys, past and present, in all their complexity. And I am grateful that I get to speak with you about these resources because you, of course, are key to the project's success. The librarians, scholars, and other readers in this room are the people who will help other Americans come to know this bookshelf. You are multiplying the impact of this carefully curated work. You are translating it, and ultimately you are passing along a gift, and it is a timely gift. In my view, there is no more important thing to our life together as human beings than mutual understanding among Muslims and non-Muslims. Muslim Journeys is a bridge to such understanding because it presents Muslim journeys as human journeys. It assumes that Muslims are no better or no worse than any other large swath of humanity. They are, in the end, just human. In this bookshelf, there are Muslim heroes and Muslim villains, but mostly there are human beings who often in the same lifetime do both good and bad things, help and hurt others, love and hate, fight and make up, welcome children into their lives and bury their dead. All of these common experiences of humanity are grounded in the lives of unique individuals who live in particular historical circumstances. Understanding those details is necessary to understanding them. We lose too much when we only embrace what we can easily see in our own lives. When we fall in love with our own image in the life of another person. Instead, this bookshelf invites us to let the experiences of people who are unfamiliar to us, shape who we are. This is the same idea as the South African principle of Ubuntu, described by one of the authors of our bookshelf, Chicagoan Ibu Patel, who discovers along his way that, quote, people are people through other people. We meet many new people in this bookshelf, which reflects the diversity of Muslims themselves. Islam, as you know, is the second most popular religion in the world after Christianity. Muslims live all over the world and speak so many different languages that most of them cannot speak with one another. The majority of Muslims live in Asia, not in the Middle East, as this map from the Pew Research Center shows. Despite some stereotypes that Muslims are a particularly religious group of human beings, this same poll found widely divergent rates of religious observance among Muslims. For example, according to the poll, about half of all Muslims in Pakistan told pollsters that they prayed several times a day. In Ghana, 94% of Muslims told the posters that they did so. In addition to these observant Muslims, there are self-described secular or cultural Muslims. Some of the people we meet in the Muslim Journeys bookshelves are deeply affected by Muslim history and Muslim cultures, but are not themselves Muslim. For example, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of House of Stone is the late Anthony Shadid, a Lebanese-American Christian. And even among believing Muslims themselves, there is a great variety in ethical behavioral, doctrinal orientation, and ritual practice. Now, how can one make sense of all this diversity among Muslims and those connected to their histories and cultures? As you know, the Muslim Journeys bookshelf does so by way of 5 well-conceived themes. The bookshelf offers 5 different pathways in its map of Muslim journeys. Though these pathways do not claim to represent any kind of comprehensive understanding of Muslim peoples and cultures, they do offer rich ways to engage Muslim experience. The first of these themes is American stories. And the point of this path is that we needn't journey abroad to understand Muslim journeys, because Muslims have always been part of the United States, even before it became a country. One Muslim journey, for example, parallels the single most important journey of our country in the 1800s, the journey from slavery to freedom. Most of the first Muslims in the United States were enslaved West Africans. And while most of them would die on U.S. soil, a few extraordinary individuals were able to use their literacy, their education, social connections, and sometimes their legerdemain to find their way home to Africa. Prince among slaves, the story of Abdurrahman Ibrahima, a former African prince and Mississippi slave who was received at the White House by President John Quincy Adams, is a tale that you wouldn't believe if it weren't for the careful historical research of author Terry Alford. Now, for anyone wanting to attract patrons interested in the history of slavery and America before the Civil War, this is a journey not to be missed. And for those more visually minded patrons, there is also a film based on the book. Having led a post-viewing conversation of the film in Indianapolis, I can say that it is a very successful way to engage people from a variety of backgrounds on this fascinating story. Now, just as the larger American experience of slavery and freedom is reflected in particular Muslim American stories, so is the epic tale of voluntary migration. Like others who came through Ellis Island, the port of New Orleans, Canada, and other points of entry, Muslim Americans such as Mary Juma sought their fortunes or escaped hardship in their native lands by coming to America. This is for our friends from North Dakota. Most of these Muslims were from what today is Syria and Lebanon, and while some of them became peddlers and dry goods salesmen and dock workers, others tried to bust the sod of the Dakota Plain and become farmers, and decided that this soil was probably not meant to be busted. Mary Juma's family settled in Ross, home of one of the first buildings built to serve as a mosque in the United States. And this is what a mosque looked like in 1930s North Dakota. The story of these immigrants and their way of life is detailed in the Columbia Sourcebook of Muslims in the United States, alongside other Muslim American stories. And if you will permit me a personal comment, I want to mention that I dedicate that book to my parents. And one of my parents, my dad, is able to be with us today, and I just want to acknowledge him and thank him for being here. Thank you. Another immigrant story, one of an immigrant's child, is told in the memoir of interfaith organizer and activist Eboo Patel. He is a follower of the Ismaili Shia, or Shiite, branch of Islam. Patel's story is one of a youth who felt alienation both from his religious traditions and from his country, especially after he became the victim of racial and religious prejudice. His search for identity, belonging, and meaning eventually led him to establish the successful Chicago-based organization called Interfaith Youth Corps. His model of interfaith cooperation is one focused on serving one another. He thinks that young people of different faiths will come to know one another when they are performing public service together. They can develop friendships and relationships of trust and solidarity even if they have different theological beliefs. And they are doing it right here in Chicago and across the country and maybe in your community. In addition to these stories about American immigrants coming to, immigrants coming to America, the journey of Muslim America is also a journey of Americans coming to Islam. The conversion of non-Muslims to Islam is part of a larger American story too, a story about Americans questioning their religious identities and sometimes leaving one religious community to join another. We are constantly reinventing ourselves in this country, and that includes in the religious sphere of life. The American search for new religious identities and meanings is one told in the selected readings from the Columbia Sourcebook, but also in the memoir of G. Willow Wilson, who finds her new faith challenged when she moves to a Muslim-majority country, Egypt, and ends up falling in love with and marrying an Egyptian man. The Butterfly Mosque is only one of the many books in the Muslim Journeys bookshelf that is devoted to what we might call, and this is not an official theme, gendered Muslim journeys. That is, journeys in which questions about gender are front and center. Questions of women's liberation and gender equality cut across many sections of the bookshelf. This focus on women's issues makes sense given its obvious centrality to the lives of both Muslims and non-Muslims. And as with all complicated issues, the bookshelf takes a number of points of view on questions regarding Muslim women. My guess is that as you introduce the bookshelf to your public audiences, you will have to come back again and again to the issue of women and Islam. Besides discussions of violence, it is often the most discussed topic when anyone brings up Islam and Muslims. And this is true across the ideological spectrum, whether we're talking about liberals or conservatives. The theme of gender and Islam is strongly present in points of view and literary reflections. Some Muslim authors some Muslims will be quite familiar, some of these authors will be quite familiar to your audience, and some of these themes will be quite familiar to your audience. They'll know things about the veil, the harem, even if they don't know much, they'll come in with a preconceived idea. And other symbols of Islam that have been depicted for a long time in the United States as impediments to women's rights and as typical signs of women's oppression in Islam. At least two of our stories are of those women who look back on their childhoods, sometimes with humor and sometimes with sharp criticism. For example, Moroccan sociologist Fatima Mernissi argues that men and women are meant to be social equals in Islam, but that idea was contradicted by her upbringing inside the harem, the all-female space in Morocco, depicting the women of such places as both proud and smart. She nevertheless presents a strong indictment of gender inequalities and social controls that were justified on Islamic grounds. Marjana Satripi, another of our authors, remembers how her life as a member of Iran's elite changed for the worse after religious leaders took charge of the Iranian Revolution. In an entertaining black and white graphic novel, she renders these men and women who followed Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini as humorless and harsh fundamentalist caricatures who forced her as a 10-year-old girl to wear the headscarf in public. Now, Satrapi's oppressive veil, a veil that is the product of coercion, contrasts powerfully with other understandings of the veil in the Muslim Journeys bookshelf. In addition to the veil of coercion, one can find examples of the veil of choice and empowerment. The American Stories section includes, for example, Harvard professor Layla Ahmed's book, A Quiet Revolution, which examines the resurgence of the headscarf among Muslim women around the world and in the United States in the late 20th century. For Layla Ahmed, the headscarf is part of a larger Islamic resurgence or revival. The activists fueling this revival, often called Islamists, believe that it is their religious duty to work for social justice and political reform. Now, surprisingly for Ahmed, it is these religious activists or Islamists who, quote, even more than secular Muslims, are at the forefront of contemporary activist struggles such as civil rights and women's rights. These scholarly findings are artfully illustrated in Layla Abu Ayla's novel Minaret, about a Sudanese immigrant to the United Kingdom. This is a story of a woman who becomes more religious as a way not only to cultivate a closer relationship to God, but also to navigate some of the universal challenges of modern life. Rather than holding on to tradition as a defense against modernity, the novel's protagonist sees Islam, the Quran, and Islamic practices such as modest dress as ways to live with dignity and beauty in a sometimes very ugly world of anti-Muslim prejudice and violence. The protagonist is no victim. She lives alone and chooses to wear a headscarf and to go to the mosque. Now, just as it will be hard to avoid discussing issues related to women and gender, no matter what theme you choose to cover in your Let's Talk About It gathering, I suspect that it will be difficult to avoid related questions about the nature of Islamic faith more generally. This is not, it's a punctuation mark there. This is not always the case, of course, and there are powerful stories in the bookshelf that put the emphasis elsewhere. For example, on the oppressive nature of Muammar Gaddafi's regime in Libya, as depicted in Hisham Mathur's in the Country of Men. But even when one tries to put the focus on the politics of repressive regimes, I suspect that the issue of religion may keep coming up. And frankly, this shouldn't surprise us. By definition, there would be no Muslim journeys without the religion of Islam. So, I want to take some time to address the theme of pathways of faith in a way that will be useful to you, no matter what theme you're focusing your discussion on. Islam, as I already illustrated during the presentation, is a diverse and dynamic religion. Islam is not monolithic, but there are shared practices. Over hundreds of years, Muslims have developed certain authoritative Islamic traditions, powerful symbols, and important ethical teachings that, while not relevant to all Muslims, are at least topics of conversation and debate among most of them. For most Muslims, there is no Islamic life without the Quran and without referring to the human being through whom, according to Islamic tradition, it was revealed, the Prophet Muhammad. I began my talk with the prophetic journey that he began in a cave on the side of a mountain outside Mecca. But this was not the only journey he undertook, and his journeys are central to pathways of faith for over 1.5 billion Muslims worldwide. In the very short introduction, Jonathan Brown helpfully details the most popular biography of the Prophet ever written, the Sirah, or biography of Ibn Ishaq. In this early biography, one learns about Muhammad's many journeys, including the miraculous ones. And one of the most important of those miraculous journeys, besides receiving the Quran itself, is Muhammad's night journey and ascension, as he miraculously traveled, according to the Quran, from the Kaaba in Mecca, the place in whose direction all Muslims around the world pray, to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and from there to the heavens, where, as the Quran puts it, he was shown the signs of God. Here he is depicted on Buraq. Another of Muhammad's key journeys was his exile from his hometown of Mecca in 622 CE. Rejected by the leaders of Mecca, his followers persecuted for believing in the one God and for following him, he barely escapes assassination as he makes his way north to the town of Yathrib. This is the year that marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar, the calendar that ends with AH instead of AD. AH means Anno Hijri, the year of the Hijra, the great immigration from Mecca to Medina. It was also the year in which Muhammad went from being a religious leader to being a political leader as well. For the next year, or for the next decade, he would serve as chief executive, judge, and legislator of a town that would come to be known as Medina, the city of the Prophet. He had his ups and downs, but by the end of his life, he left a new political power in the Middle East. Now, the legacy of the Prophet is one that Muslims and non-Muslims would debate from that day forward. And Jonathan Brown's book helpfully recounts the controversies over interpreting Muhammad's life in the modern age. Without taking sides in the debates, Brown shows the deep chasm between the Muhammad that observant Muslims deeply love, respect, and admire, you might call this the Muhammad of faith, and the Muhammad whom some non-Muslims have criticized or even mocked. He also shows the scholarly debates over what we can know about the historical Muhammad, making an important distinction between the Muhammad of history and the Muhammad of Islamic faith. Now, the other essential pathway of faith, of course, is the Quran. And Ingrid Mattson's Story of the Quran is a really important book because it outlines the history of the text itself, the historical circumstances of its revelation, the ways that it has been interpreted by Muslim scholars through the ages, but also, finally, she insists on trying to understand how the Quran has worked, has mattered to the life journeys of ordinary Muslims. So in this book, we get to see how the Quran, or calligraphic renderings of it, became Muslim art, how people use the Quran as an object and a source of inspiration in their daily lives, how it is displayed, how it is studied by people all over the world. Mattson also explains how memorizing and reciting it is one of the highest callings, particularly of young observant Muslims, which is also the subject of the HBO documentary Quran by Heart. Now, as important as Muhammad and the Quran are, and essential to understanding pathways of Islamic faith, coming to know the religious journeys of Muslims also means paying attention to the ways that Muslims themselves continue to debate some of the most fundamental questions of their faith. For over hundreds of years, Muslim scholars, the ulama, would develop learned opinions on ethical behavior, seeking to know which behaviors are mandatory, recommended, ethically neutral, discouraged, and prohibited, haram. This process of judging all human behavior was necessary in order to follow in the path of God, which is called the Sharia by Muslims. I will be surprised if this term Sharia does not also come up in your discussions. Some people translate Sharia as Islamic law, but in my view, that's incorrect. It's too narrow a definition in the English language. Sharia literally means path, and this is the way that the Quran itself refers to it when it uses the word in reference to the idea that God put the Prophet Muhammad on an ordained religious path. And this path to the ideal Muslim life includes far more than what we generally think of as criminal and civil law. It outlines how to pray, how to fast, and perform other ritual obligations. And it includes guidelines on how to nurture your spirituality. And throughout most of Islamic history, most Muslims have seen Sharia as something that encompasses rather than opposes the inner life. Most Muslims have desired a spiritual life in which they come to know God intimately, to love God and to feel God's love in return. Islamic spirituality is often referred to by the term Sufism, which has also been defined as Islamic mysticism. For hundreds of years, Muslims have created and sustained Sufi religious orders devoted to helping their members cultivate the inner life. A Sufi order is called a tariqah, another word that means path. And the point of this pathway of faith, as outlined in the beautiful poem of Farid ad-Din Attar called The Conference of the Birds, is to discover that God's love exists within us. It is inside of us all, no matter what we look like, no matter what our weaknesses, we can find God's presence there. This poem, written in Persian, tells the story of birds who set off to find the king of all birds, the great Simorgh. Each bird represents a different human weakness, and they must overcome these weaknesses if they are to have a successful journey. Their guide is the bird called the hoopoe, the sheikh of the journey, who helps them overcome their selfish desires. And when some of them finally make it to the throne of their king, they discover that the divine is far closer to them than they thought. It is actually inside themselves. As the Quran puts it, God is closer to you than your jugular vein. Now, the Conference of the Birds is an allegory, but not all Muslim spiritual journeys are allegorical. Sometimes in Muslim pathways of faith, spiritual journeys and physical journeys are one. And there is no better example of this than the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca during the last month of the Islamic lunar calendar. The art of Hajj beautifully illustrates the meaning of the pilgrimage by exploring its arts. The paintings of the caravans that went on Hajj, the maps that they used to get there, the textiles that they brought with them to decorate the Kaaba, the illustrated manuals that gave instructions on how to perform this complicated ritual, and the ways that pilgrims decorate their homes when they return. The Hajj is a Muslim journey of incredible human solidarity. The feeling of being one with all humankind often transports the pilgrim to a space that feels to some like heaven on earth. It is the kind of experience that inspires people to write poetry, as the 16th century pilgrim Muhyiddin ad-Din Lari wrote in Persian when he finally arrived at the sacred house, the Kaaba, originally built by Abraham and rededicated by Muhammad to the one God. And he wrote, "What I have experienced from seeing that sight is a mystery that I am unable to divulge. My heart became drowned in an ocean of meaning. I was lost to myself in the glory of beauty. It made me bewildered, amazed, stupefied. The house of my being parted from its foundations? Crying out, I made for the place of circumambulation. Dancing, I came forward for my circumambulation. God's infinite generosity became manifest as I planted a kiss upon the black stone, revolving, circling, and full of presence. I became a moth, and God, the luminous candle." It is hard to imagine a more powerful physical and spiritual journey than that. So far, I have spoken today about several different Muslim journeys: pathways of faiths, one I made up, gendered journeys, and American stories. And I know you are hungry and want to go to dinner. But let me ask you, like those birds traveling to see the Simorgh, to stick with me a moment longer so I can tell you about one more theme in the Muslim Journeys bookshelf: connected histories. Now, the theme of connected histories is another angle of vision on the idea that Muslim journeys are human journeys. It is a story not only about our shared ancestors, but about our shared past. This is really important to keep in mind because the world of our ancestors was a very different one. Any journey back in time to any place, even our hometowns, is a journey to foreign country. We are assaulted with a way of life radically different from our own. So one of the challenges of the section on connected histories is to emphasize that the cultural difference we encounter may not be so much because the lands about which we read were inhabited by Muslims, but because the stories happened so long ago. Rather than seeing Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Buddhists as isolated communities, this theme captures the ways in which they lived in shared, cosmopolitan, and interconnected worlds. The theme of connected history shows us that the Old World, sometimes called Afro-Eurasia, was defined by constant trade, travel, pilgrimage, warfare, and other forms of contact, conflict, and exchange. In this era, there was not so much what we would call today a West or an East, but instead regional zones of civilizations. And much of the Old World's economic activity and scientific innovation was centered in Asia. When we think of Islam as a Middle Eastern religion, though we may think of it as a Middle Eastern religion, one of the books in this theme, When Asia Was the World, helps to explain how Islam became a global religion. This book also sets the stage for others to come. In the words of Giancarlo Casale, we meet a Baghdadi envoy sent to the untamed steppes of Central Asia as a representative of the Muslim caliph, a Jewish merchant from Islamic Cairo with business interests stretching from India to Tunisia, a Muslim bureaucrat from southern China who traveled to the heartland of the Islamic world on the famed treasure ships of the early Ming dynasty, unquote. Connected history also shines a spotlight on medieval advances in the sciences, as Baghdad's famed House of Wisdom, a 9th century institute for advanced study, made new discoveries in algebra, trigonometry, clinical pharmacology, optics, and anatomy, among other fields of research. This was not a democratic age, but it was a pluralistic one. The Abrahamic faith communities of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, though part of this Asian world, were centered in the medieval Mediterranean world. There, they created the multicultural societies that were remarkably tolerant of different ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups. This is particularly true in the Iberian Peninsula, where Muslim caliphs in the city of Cordoba created a European Muslim society that was marked by its architectural splendor. In Maria Rose Menacau's Ornament of the World, we learn how Christian and Muslim princes began to compete with each other in Iberia as each tried to patronize the most beautiful art and architecture. But eventually, we also see how that world came apart. The end of the tri-faith community of Iberia occurs as a result of Ferdinand and Isabella's Reconquista in 1492, and soon all Jews and Muslims were forced to convert, to go into exile, or were killed. And this is where the story of Leo Africanus begins. Now, we really don't know what he looked like. Here are two possibilities. The book, Leo Africanus, is a real swashbuckler at times, as this fictionalized account of a real person sends its protagonists on journeys from Granada to Fez, Morocco, and from there to Timbuktu, Cairo, Istanbul, and Rome. Along the way, this Muslim born in Spain owns a slave and becomes a slave himself, earns a fortune, loses it, and writes an Arabic, Latin, Hebrew dictionary. He is baptized a Christian by the Pope, but he seems to have died a Muslim. In the novel, the great traveler's tale ends as he approaches the coast of North Africa, site of his final exile. Some of his last words are written for his son, and even though they are the particular words of one parent to one child, they embody a deeply humanistic sensibility. These words restate the idea that Muslim journeys are human journeys. Wherever you are, some will want to ask questions about your skin or your prayers. Beware of gratifying their instincts, my son. Beware of bending before the multitude. Muslim, Jew, or Christian, they must take you as you are or lose you. When men's minds seem narrow to you, tell yourself that the land of God is broad. Broad his hands and broad his heart. Never hesitate to go far away beyond all seas, all frontiers, all countries, all beliefs. This is compelling advice to those about to begin life's journey. But all journeys have an end. We grow old and get tired, or we just need a rest. For my part, Leo Africanus declares, I have reached the end of my wanderings. 40 years of adventures have made my gait heavy and my breathing burdensome. I have no longer any desire other than to live peaceful days in the bosom of my family, and to be, of all those that I love, the first to depart towards the final place where no man is a stranger before the face of the Creator. Thank you very much.